So let's make a start on the webinar. Good morning, everybody, and thanks very much for coming along. This webinar presents the findings of the Welfare at a Social Distance project. We've got socially distanced seminar this morning on Zoom, and particularly looking at trends in attitudes to benefits during COVID-19, issues of solidarity and exceptionalism. Well, we've got a range of speakers. Ben Baumberg-Geiger and Rob De Vries will present the quantitative findings of the project, and Kate will talk about qualitative findings. We've only got an hour for the presentation, so I'll shut up now and hand over to Ben and Rob to kick things off. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. And yes, so as Peter said, we're part of the Welfare at a Social Distance project, which is a large project funded by the UKRI COVID Rapid Response Fund to look at a number of aspects of the welfare system over the course of the pandemic. But today we'll be focusing on a strand of the project, which is looking at the effect the pandemic might have had on people's attitudes towards benefits and the benefit system and benefit claims. So we'll be talking for about 30 minutes, and then so hopefully we'll have the remainder of the time, about half an hour, for what I think will be hopefully a really interesting discussion. So there are broadly three really good reasons to expect that the pandemic had a profound effect on people's attitudes towards the benefit system and towards benefit claims. The first is that there's just been this enormous expansion in the number of people claiming benefits. We can see it on this slide if this system is actually working. I don't seem to be able to control your screen anymore, Beth. Yep, I can't move the slides forward. Can you move your slides forward, Ben? Okay, cool.
Is that working again now?
Let me check. Yes. Okay, great. Sorry about that. Technical hitches. We tested it extensively before this meeting, but of course it doesn't work in the live situation. So there's been this massive expansion in the number of people claiming benefits. And you can see here on this graph, this enormous spike in claims to universal credit coinciding with the first lockdown. And so you've got many, many more people having direct experience of the benefit system. And also this exponentially larger group around them of family members and friends who are seeing a loved one who is newly claiming benefits during the pandemic. You've also got this group of people who are supported through furlough or through the self-employment income support scheme. And these schemes were not administered through the conventional benefit system, but for those people, that is still an experience of being out of work and being supported by the government through a form of welfare. And the second reason we should expect that the benefits attitudes will have changed is that benefit claimants are being written and talked about very differently than they have been previously. So you can see there are people, these are groups who clearly have very little control over their circumstances. So you can't really blame anyone necessarily for losing their job or having to go on furlough because of COVID. And if you looked at the media coverage of these groups, they were described in very different terms to the way that benefit claimants would have been described prior to the pandemic. So there were lots of stories in the media about these people who were formerly successful and who had never dreamed of claiming benefits. You know, they could never imagine this situation in which they would have to claim benefits, but they were now having to. This was quite a popular kind of genre of media coverage. And the final reason is really that COVID, especially early on in the first wave, was this time of at least perceived national solidarity. So there's all these messages about us being all in this together. There's the clap for carers, there's these new mutual aid groups, springing up, and this idea that we're all trying to help each other. And this has been described by various people as a potential for a new beverage moment. And if you put all this stuff together, it speaks to this potentially really powerful change in how people feel about benefits, about the welfare system. So let's have a look at what actually happened. So to look at trends in attitudes, we've used data from YouGov's welfare tracker series. So these are surveys that take place roughly every 8 weeks using the same methodology, so they're comparable over time. So this is this very uniquely detailed picture of attitude change over the course of the pandemic, which avoids the problems of previous analyses that have tried to analyse trends in attitudes over the course of the pandemic, which is that a lot of surveys that were trying to say, okay, well, we know what attitudes were before, how did they change over the pandemic, were forced to switch survey modes. They were forced to switch from, for example, being in person to being conducted online. And we know that that switch can change how people respond to surveys. So the problem there is that if you see any change, is that actually because of the pandemic, or is it because the people are answering using a different response format? And usually also these surveys are only for a couple of time points. And because of the rapid potential for change associated with the pandemic, the experience of the first lockdown is very different to the experience of what's going on in the summer. And so depending on where you do your single wave of this survey, you might be picking up on a very different picture in the population. So for this analysis, we focused on two measures. The first one we focused on is people's perceptions of how deserving claimants are. So people are asked, thinking about people who receive welfare benefits, including disability benefits, out-of-work benefits, and benefits to support people in low-paying work, what proportion of people receiving benefits do you think are genuinely in need and deserving of help? So it's this question that's asking you basically, of all the people who are claiming benefits, what proportion of them, what fraction of that group do you think actually deserve it? And the second measure we focused on is perceptions of whether benefits are too high, too low, or about right. So people are basically straightforwardly asked, do you think benefit payments are too high, are they too low, or are they about right? And this is what our results show. If again, I can actually get the slide to change. So these are the trends in these measures over the course of the pandemic. At the top in green is deservingness. So this measure of how deserving people are perceived to be. And here we focused on the proportion of people who are saying that around half or fewer of claimants are deserving. So it's a sort of measure of anti-welfare attitudes. So if the line goes up, that means people's attitudes are getting harsher. If the line goes down, then people's attitudes are getting more generous. And the blue line below it is the proportion of people saying that benefit levels are too high. So again, it's this anti-welfare attitude. If it goes up, then more people are thinking, oh, benefits are too high. Whereas if the line goes down, that shows people's attitudes getting a bit more generous. And really, you can see the lines are moving up and down a little bit in this chart. But really, the overwhelming message of this graph is that the pandemic has had relatively little effect on people's attitudes. So if you look at the first wave of the pandemic, which is that first grey bar that you can see on the chart, this is the first lockdown when the solidarity messages, all that stuff is at its peak, really. And you can see that for both of these measures, there's a tiny bit of a drop, but it's not much, there's not really much going on. It's a relatively small change, and it bounces back pretty severely in the summer between the summer of 2020, between the first and second waves. We get a little bit of a dip again into the second wave in the winter of 2020, 2021. But again, this change is not particularly big. It's bigger for deservingness, but that's because the bounce back in attitudes in the summer for deservingness was actually quite large. So to get a sense of kind of how small these shifts are, we can compare them, first of all, to this first drop that we see, this drop that you see in December. If you look at December in the chart, you can see that there's a drop associated with both of these measures here. So people's attitudes are getting a bit more generous in December. And that is kind of a Christmas effect. So in other measures of welfare attitudes, you do see that people's attitudes get a bit more generous around the Christmas period. Christmas being a kind of time for giving, a time for charity. So people's kind of attitudes get a little bit softer over that period. And you can see that if we compare that to the effect of the pandemic's not having much of a bigger effect than the effect of Christmas. So this once in a lifetime, unprecedented event is not doing anything much more than what we see every year around the Christmas period. You can also see this if we look at these changes in the context of the longer term change that's happened over the last decade. So if we just look at the benefit levels are too high measure here, because that's the measure that we have historically from YouGov, we can see that there's been this very large decline in the percentage of people saying that benefits are too high. So I should note that this is a straight line just because we only have data for this one time point historically, and then the data picks up again in 2019. It's not actually a smooth just decline over this whole period, but it is a very large decline, and the scale of that decline is much larger than any apparent effect of the pandemic. So really the story here is that there's not actually as much going on as we would have expected going into it. So I'm going to hand over to Ben now to answer the question of, okay, well, why is that the case? Why haven't we seen this massive change?
Thanks, Rob. And yeah, I'll just sort of pick up in the next bit, and then Rob and I will go to and for the final bits of the story. So the question now is, does this mean that those ideas that people were going to think differently about benefit claimants are all wrong? Is this a completely nonsense way of thinking that just didn't happen at all? And there are some people, so here's a comment piece from Prof Toynbee, in the aftermath of a King's Policy Institute Ipsos Mori study, spring, summer, sort of saying that a certain number of people were blamed for losing their jobs. And so there was a certain amount of comment, and Prof Toynbee is not the only person to pick this up, saying, well, actually, a lot of people are very unsympathetic in their views of people during the pandemic. So what we wanted to do was to test this. You know, is it really the case that people think no differently about claimants in the pandemic than they do for pre-pandemic claimants? So to do this, as well as using the YouGov trackers, sort of pre-existing ones that YouGov kindly shared with us in the first part, in this part, we're using a new YouGov survey conducted as part of the Welfare at Social Distance project, and that's from June this year, so not very long ago, and about 3,500 people took part. It's worth having a quick caveat here around limitations to representativeness in YouGov surveys, particularly around English language and digital skills, just because it's an online survey. And there's always questions with surveys about representativeness and weighting. But I think it's fair to say that the YouGov surveys are broadly representative of the UK population. And the data for this survey, ideally it would already be there, but we were just trying to get the report out as quickly as we could. But it's going to be there really soon. So certainly by mid-October, you'll be able to download this YouGov survey and explore it yourself. So to get at this idea of whether people viewed pre-pandemic and COVID-19 claimants as different or the same, we took a number of different approaches. So the first one I'm going to go with you is just, we asked people whether they blamed people. So one of the things we asked them is whether people were to blame for losing their job. And we asked this for pre-pandemic claimants and COVID-19 claimants. And these were sort of side by side for people in the question. And so what I draw your attention to in this graph is the red bits at the bottom. So the two different shades of red, they reflect people that thought of half or more of claimants were to blame for losing their job. And you'll see pre-pandemic, about 20% of people thought that half or more of claimants were to blame for losing their job. But during COVID-19, this was far, far fewer, around 5%. So you see a really big shift in people's attitudes in terms of COVID-19 claimants and pre-pandemic claimants. You see some things similar. So another half, randomly half of people saw a question about blame for losing their job or blame for being unable to get a job. And if you have a look at people's blame for being unable to get a job rather than initially losing it, you'll see there's higher levels of blame here. Pre-pandemic, we're getting close to a third of people thinking that half or more claimants were to be blamed for being unable to get a job. And for COVID-19 claimants, it's again higher than it was blamed for losing a job, but it's still far, far fewer. So what this really shows quite strongly is a kind of a difference in attitudes between COVID-19 claimants and pre-pandemic claimants. Now, we wanted to really make sure of this, so we used several different approaches for having a look at the way in which people think differently about COVID-19 and pre-pandemic claimants. So one of them is we directly asked people if they thought that COVID-19 claimants were more likely to be deserving than pre-pandemic claimants. And about half of people said yes. And very small numbers of people thought that pre-pandemic claimants were more deserving. The other people either don't know or thought they were the same. Finally, rather than asking it so directly, we gave people hypothetical vignettes. So half of people saw a vignette that included a pre-pandemic claimant, and half of people saw a vignette that included a COVID-19 claimant. So they couldn't sort of second guess what they thought we were trying to ask them here. They only saw one claimant type. But in these vignettes, people that saw a pre-pandemic claimant were nearly twice as likely to say they were at least a little bit to blame for being out of work compared to people that saw a COVID-19 claimant. So all of this is really pretty convincing that despite the kind of flatlining general welfare attitudes that Rob talked about so far, people are sort of giving different answers in terms of the deservingness they see for pre-pandemic and COVID-19 claimants. So Rob, I'll pass back to you at this point.
Thank you. Yeah, so to unpack this a little bit more, we asked people directly what they thought were the main differences, if any, between people claiming benefits before COVID and people claiming benefits during COVID. And so these were open text responses, so people could really write whatever they wanted. So they could write there were no differences, they could write anything they liked to say what were the differences between these groups of people. About a quarter of people said that there were no differences between these groups. About another 13% wrote some version, don't know, or unintelligible kind of string of characters or something. And for the remaining responses, we used a machine learning procedure called structural topic modeling to try and organize these responses into categories. So obviously when you have thousands of responses of these open text responses, it's very hard to manually go in and say, okay, well, this is this type of response, this is this type of response. So that's why we use this kind of machine learning procedure. And what this procedure basically does is try to identify similarities between these responses based on the words that they use. So people who use very similar words, their responses get grouped together into one category. People who use dissimilar words, then they would get grouped into different categories. And we settled on a 7-category or 7-topic model. And some of those topics didn't necessarily focus directly on this idea of deservingness. So some of the topics, for example, were about living standards. It was about, okay, well, did COVID have a bigger effect on the living standards of people who were already claiming, or on people who were just new to claiming? Other ones focused, for example, on the idea of fraud, with some people actually suspecting that there might be more potential for fraud among COVID claimants because a lot of the restrictions had been relaxed. But those were these kind of less popular topics. Other topics fit much more clearly into this idea of COVID claimants being seen as this exceptional group, this very different group. And the clearest examples are topic 7 here, which was actually the most popular category of response, and topic 6. And these are the ones that I've shown on the slide here. So topic 7 focused on the idea that COVID claimants were a fundamentally different sort of person to pre-COVID claimants. The thing that kept coming up and up and up in the responses that fall into this category was that these people had established careers. So COVID claimants had established careers and that they had never expected to claim benefits. So this idea of never expecting to claim came up quite a lot. And also this idea that they just lost jobs through really no fault of their own. And topic 6 makes this even stronger. So it identifies COVID claimants as people who were employed at the outset and therefore clearly wanted to work. There was this idea that that COVID claimants had demonstrated somehow, because they were working at the outset of the pandemic, that they were the kind of person who wanted to work. And this was contrasted with, sometimes implicitly but often explicitly, pre-COVID claimants who were perceived as people who didn't want to work, as sometimes directly described as spongers or scroungers. That language did come up explicitly. And this really matches up quite nicely with how these claimants were covered in the media. So COVID claimants, as I showed on the slide before, there was a lot of the kind of undercurrent of this coverage was COVID claimants are not these kind of chabby scroungers that you're used to. You're not, when you think of a benefit claimant, that's not who these COVID claimants are. They're a completely different sort of person. They had jobs before, some of them might even have been management consultants or like executives or something. And that was this undercurrent of this coverage. And you can see that coming out in these responses. So if we take all of these responses together, they do paint a picture of this COVID exceptionalism, of this idea that COVID claimants are being seen as a fundamentally different sort of person from the kind of person who was claiming before the pandemic. So I'll hand back over to Ben at this point to kind of wrap up what this means for our understanding of people's attitudes towards benefits and the welfare system.
Yeah, so I'm just going to finish with 2 slides that sort of put this together, at least the quantitative part, which is in our report released today, which you can link to from our website, before Kate goes into some of the qualitative results that are not in the report in a bit more detail. So just to make our argument sort of really clear at this point, we argue that this shows COVID exceptionalism, by which we mean that new claimants are seen positively, but they are mentally bracketed from so-called normal claimants in ways that mean that they don't change sort of wider attitudes to the benefit system. So this is implied by our results so far. So there's no change in these sort of, or very little change in these general attitudes, but COVID claimants are seen substantially more positively. And in fact, we can also test this directly. So we can look at the statistical relationship between general attitudes and views of the blameworthiness of pre-pandemic claimants versus COVID claimants. And we find that general attitudes are noticeably more strongly related to views of pre-pandemic claimants than they are of COVID claimants. And Rob's also talked through the results of coding the open text responses as well, all of which I think paints this picture which chimes very well with kind of anecdotally looking at media coverage and some trends that people have observed that can happen in recessions as well. What I want to conclude with, though, is trying to sort of say that this should not be interpreted as saying that the public has little appetite for a more generous system. So I think for those people that want a more generous system, there was a hope for, you know, a new beverage moment from COVID-19, which doesn't appear to be borne out. But 2 key points. Firstly, attitudes pre-COVID were much more pro-welfare than they have been since the 1990s on a whole bunch of different measures. We show this in the YouGov data, the changes since 2013, and from British social attitudes, we know this really long-running and widespread change as well. And what's more, if increases are framed as COVID-related, then you get even more support for them. So it's not the case this automatically goes through into general responses, but if we talk about, you know, the £20 uplift as being COVID related, then there's a lot of support for that happening during the pandemic. And still, you know, 50% of people think it should be made permanent, far more than who don't. And that is much higher than the proportion of people who say that benefits in general are too low. It is worth putting this in a wider context. We can't really talk about it a lot, but we may come back in the discussion about the role of public attitudes and reform of the benefit system. I think Neil Lunt might be here, and this comes out of some of his work, John Hudson, that, you know, it wasn't the case that, for example, the beverage report came because there was massive public demand for it and it was just acquiescing with that demand. You know, there does have to be a certain amount of latent public support, but fundamentally political leadership matters. You know, there are lots of different ways that you can go with public attitudes being what they are. And COVID allows us spaces to talk about reforms to the benefit system in ways that are more convincing than maybe they would otherwise have been. So in a way, just to conclude temporarily here, you know, the impact of COVID-19 has not yet happened. It is not all yet done. In a way, it is all to play for. So I will stop there and we can hand over to Kate.
Right, well, thank you very much, Ben and Rob. It's good to see questions already coming in. We'll deal with those in a minute, but first, Kate's presentation talking about the qualitative data. So over to you, Kate.
Great, thanks very much, Peter. Let me just share my screen. So I'm going to share some of the data from our in-depth interviews, which comprises one of the 3 work packages that make up Welfare at Social Distance project. So in the earlier stages of developing mixed methods work, thinking about benefits attitudes. And the aim of my presentation today is to share some preliminary insights from our qualitative data. So quickly to summarise what I'm drawing on here, these are longitudinal in-depth interviews with claimants themselves. Our participants were first interviewed in the summer of 2020, and then again in spring, summer 2021. So we just finished the second wave of interviews with a retention rate of 82%. And you'll see we interviewed 74 and 61 people. We interview both existing and new working age social security benefit claimants. So that means people whose claim had begun before the pandemic, and then people whose claim began during the pandemic. We ask both about experiences of the social security system, as well as attitudes towards it. And the data is analysed thematically using a primarily top-down approach where codes are developed and then applied to the data set. And before I move on to showing you some of this data, I want to briefly emphasise what this sort of data is for, given this is a presentation where we've just looked at survey data and now I'm showing you some interview data. Sometimes I think we can maybe lose sight of this a bit. So just to emphasise that these in-depth interviews with a sample of people who are not statistically representative of our population of interest, so in this case benefit claimants, cannot and should not tell us about how common or uncommon something is. But on the other hand, I think it's also a disservice to these sorts of methods and the time and information shared by our participants to think of these interviews as just providing anecdotes or colour to sit alongside our survey data. So instead, I think this data complements our survey data and vice versa. So our interviews providing us depth of various kinds, whereas the surveys sort of, I guess, bluntly put, provide breadth of various kinds. More specifically, these interviews give us access to the detail and contours of what some people might call the narratives or discourses being put forward by our interviewees. So by that, I mean the shared meanings or language that are used to talk about and make sense of aspects of the social world. An interview can also get aspects of what we might call self-presentation. So how people give an account of themselves or what they do, what they think in the context of this two-way conversation that they're taking part in. So with that quickly established, what I've chosen to do today is share one extended quote from one interviewee. And I want to interpret this in light of the entire collection of interviews we've gathered and analysed and the survey data that Ben and Rob have just shared with us. And I hope by presenting just one account, this gives us some of the depth to complement the breadth that we've thought about this morning so far. And I think it kind of starts us towards understanding a bit more about where COVID exceptionism comes from the perspective of claimants themselves. So this is Tim speaking, who's an existing claimant, meaning his claim began before the pandemic. He receives ESA, which means his health condition affects his ability to work. He's currently unemployed, and this is from his second interview, so completed a couple of months ago. And I realise there's an awful lot on the screen, so I will just read this to you, if you don't mind. So Tim says, I think COVID-19 has opened the door to how benefit claimants are paid and seen. Before COVID-19, it was, quote, you're on benefits, you're a scrounger, and you're just going to smoke it. Or I'm striving to pay my rent and they're getting all their rent paid free. All the stuff in comments. I don't go around going, look, I'm on the benefit system. I don't even tell people some of the time. I tend to be very closed off. When COVID-19 came about, it was all about there were so many. I wouldn't say they're normal people, but people that aren't disabled and haven't got serious disabilities were having to claim it and seeing the other side of the system. I think now it's got a bigger voice, and what Rashford has done as well has given it a bigger platform now. We'll have to see for the future and see my point of view. I don't really tell people about it, that I'm a claimant. I probably don't tell people about it because you're almost, oh, you're a scrounger, whereas I'm not a scrounger. If some of the problems are not what they are, I'd go out to work. So he's talking about his health there. Probably again, and probably with access to work, but with COVID-19, there's going to be even more problems for the future. So first here, what I want to note is how Tim draws on this figure of the undeserving poor. He sets it up in the bit I've highlighted at the beginning there. He's using the familiar trope of the scrounger and how benefit scroungers spend fecklessly, so here on cigarettes. And although this is a caricature and not something that Tim is wholesale sort of signing up to himself when he's talking about it, I think it's important to note the ongoing ease with which this image of the pre-COVID feckless benefit recipient can be sort of summarised and deployed. And indeed, what we then see Tim go on to do is distance himself from this negative stereotype. So in our analysis of interviews with both existing and new benefit claimants, this need to distance oneself from the caricature of the scrounger is there. We know from previous work that people kind of want to and work to disassociate themselves from the label of poverty. And we see this here in terms of benefit receipt. So I think it's important to note that COVID exceptionalism, in the sense that this involves drawing distinctions between different types in scare quotes of claimants, is not something new. As we unpick Tim's account further, I also chose this extract because you see his slip in language here highlighted in green, capturing something very direct about COVID exceptionalism. He sort of catches himself describing COVID claimants as normal people. In our analysis of the interviews so far, and complementing the structural topic models that Dan and Rob have shown us this morning, there are various characteristics that are associated with COVID claimants to clarify that this group of claimants is different. So in our interviews, these cluster around assertions about class. So that is COVID claimants being middle class and pre-COVID claimants not. Employment history and not having had gaps in your employment if you're a COVID claimant, but then also more explicit moral judgments. So things like COVID claimants being well organized, being planners, being careful with money. The implication here that they're kind of only under extreme circumstances of COVID, this group sort of became claimants, because otherwise they would have sort of weathered kind of less serious storms. So for Tim specifically then as well, you see, relating to his own personal biography, it's notable for him that he thinks of COVID claimants as not disabled. And so what we're finding sort of alongside the caricature of the pre-COVID claimant, there's this emerging positive caricature of the COVID claimant in our accounts of both existing and new claimants themselves. So in the report, we detail how respondents tend to centre the extreme macro events caused by the pandemic and what this meant for lack of control over one's situation. And I think it's kind of significant that when we look at the accounts of claimants themselves, it's personal characteristics that are being engaged with more centrally as they try and make sense of their own identity and position. So then I'll finish with a bit more from Tim as he reflects on how COVID might change the benefit system. So I'll read this again. So he says, yes, the COVID situation might change elements of the system, but we're still watching and we're still waiting, if that makes sense, because COVID is still here and people are still getting sick. I think it's a wait and see game with the benefit system in terms of COVID and how people will react to it in the future. I think the people that have interacted with it, and even the people that haven't interacted with it and are secretly struggling, I think even they're at the point where, quote, well, it's the benefit system. I didn't apply to it, but I could have applied for it. It's almost an embarrassment for some people, I think. A lot of people don't need to see it like that. I think a lot of it is, and then quote again, I don't want to take money from the government. Well, why not? I think that that is the argument for the future. Why aren't you taking that money? They're taking money from you. It's a waiting game. So we asked our interview participants to reflect on the broader system as well as their own personal experiences, and you see that's what Tim's doing here. And we see Tim suggesting that exposure of more people to the benefit system might provide a catalyst for change. And what we do find across the accounts of both existing and new claimants is that they predict or experience this greater exposure to the benefit system, and therefore that creating the potential for kind of greater sympathy. But importantly, thinking about our interview data, I think the correct terminology here is sympathy and not empathy. So with COVID claimants, they're predominantly seeing themselves as a part, as we're kind of establishing in our report, and different from existing claimants. And I think the fact that it's sympathy rather than empathy is a potential sort of restriction on the scope for change. And sort of layered on top of this, stigma and shame do remain a sticking point for change in attitudes towards claimants. I want to end then by echoing the conclusion of the report and what this all means potentially in terms of some of the politics and policy around this, which really remains an open question. So as part of COVID claimants' narratives that the conditions that precipitated their claim were completely out of their control, sort of the conditions of COVID being so uncontrollable was part of what justified their claims. But then as we see Tim pointing out here at the end, he sees part of this as sort of an argument to take forward into the future. Why aren't you taking that money is the question to ask. But I think the answer to this and the shift towards generous attitudes involves, therefore, in part, reimagining economic forces outside of the context of COVID and what this means for control over one's circumstances for claiming. And the scale of that task, of that sort of reimagining, shouldn't be underestimated. And I'll finish just with a final word from Tim, we should remember that we're trying to interpret these phenomena as things are still unfolding. We're still kind of very much in the midst of all of this. And so politically speaking, as Ben concluded, there's a window of opportunity here where what happens next is really yet to be determined. I'll end there. Thanks very much.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Kate. Time presses. Let's move on to questions. Some of the questions have already been answered in the Q&A, but some for live answer. So starting off with Ed Pybus from CPAG. Does this mean that there's still a big distinction between the deserving poor post-pandemic and the undeserving poor pre-pandemic claimants? So who's answered that? Ben, is that for you?
I'll start and then the others can chip into it. I mean, partly in the way of telling the story, we were emphasizing differences between perceptions of pre-pandemic and COVID-19 claimants. One thing to emphasize is that most people thought that most pre-pandemic claimants were, not blameworthy and deserving of support, and that echoes other things that I've written about before. There's always a split in the population between people that are making those distinctions and they're really important in their attitudes and people that aren't. And that has shifted a bit between the pandemic, but it certainly isn't the case that all pre-pandemic claimants are seen as not deserving and all COVID-19 claimants are seen as completely deserving. There's just there is a quite strong distinction between a group of people, but not everyone was making that. I think, Rob, I don't know if you want to add anything on.
Yeah, I was, definitely that's worth raising, is that there's this, it's easy to think that all of the pre-pandemic claimants were being viewed in this quite hostile way, whereas actually attitudes towards that group were quite positive and sympathetic. It's just that they were even more so when you look at COVID claimants. But I think in terms of that bigger, broader question of is this a kind of instantiation of the long-running desire to bracket claimants into these groups of deserving or undeserving? I think that's still true. I think it's the case that claimants themselves and also the general public are looking for deservingness cues, and COVID-19 is this very big deservingness cue of, oh, you're claiming during the pandemic, then I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt. You are someone who has clearly lost their job because of this massive, unprecedented event, and therefore you go in the deserving bucket.
I think I'd just add briefly as well that, at least from the perspective of claimants themselves, COVID claimants are aware in the sense that you see in their accounts that they're reacting to this deserving, undeserving distinction. So you see people claiming during COVID in their interviews wanting to talk about, well, I've had a work history with no gaps, this was totally beyond my control. So I think in the sense that exists, the distinction exists in that sense, in that claimants themselves kind of feel that they have to respond to it and kind of place themselves and show why they are deserving rather than undeserving.
Yeah. Right, thank you. Next question is from Hayley Bennett. In the survey process, people who responded to questions about whether those who had lost their jobs deserved it or not, did respondents also answer proxy questions to establish their knowledge on unemployment's rights? Was there a link between correct knowledge and views on deservingness in relation to job losses and redundancy? Who knows about that? Kate, did that come out of the interviews?
I don't know if Ben, Rob, if you want to talk about the survey first.
Yeah, so I mean, the short answer is we didn't ask those factual questions, but I think the longer answer, probably Ben, you're given that you've written about benefit myths before, I think probably you're better equipped to answer that.
Yeah, I mean, one sort of response to the question and then just a comment on it. The general response is I would assume that people didn't have a very good understanding about employment rates, given I don't think people's judgments, you have them in a survey and you have their responses and they look very solid. But I think Peter was making a comment by email yesterday that we can sometimes misunderstand quite how solid they are. Sometimes these are kind of general senses that people are responding to kind of quickly in a survey. And I think their knowledge about things about employment rights are going to be sketchy at best. But I really take your point that which is implicit in the question, is that a certain amount of this will be driven by misunderstandings of what people's rights were, or indeed about how willing employers were to violate some of the rights that they shouldn't have done in the law, but they nevertheless managed to get away with doing, which anecdotally we know happened.
Yeah. And there is, of course, substantial literature in British social attitudes and other surveys about people's ignorance about benefit levels, who gets benefits and so on. Move on to the next question. Tom Porter, I understand it's early days, but did you get any sense in the free text or qualitative data as to whether long COVID claimants fall within the exceptional group, or are the suspected of being inauthentic group?
I'll leave it to Kate to talk about the qualitative data, but I'll say that long COVID didn't really come up in our free text responses to the survey data. So when people were thinking about COVID claimants, I think they were thinking about people who were claiming in the short term because they had lost their job. They weren't thinking necessarily in terms of disability as caused by long COVID symptoms. But I don't know whether it came up in the qualitative interviews, Kate.
I can't think specifically about long COVID. So in the middle of analysing the second wave of interviews, where it might be that there's a higher sort of awareness or experience of long COVID, I think something kind of adjacent to that is that in our first wave of interviews, it was the sort of majority view was that COVID would be over by the autumn of 2020. And sort of here we are a year later. And so I think some of the narratives that we're talking about around deservingness was linked to this being sort of a shock that was really thought to be short term in terms of people's claiming experiences. And then we see ourselves kind of a year later with a lot of the same debates going on. And I wonder whether long COVID plays into that's not quite fitting with sort of the original puzzle that people had kind of made in their heads, that this is exceptional, it's a shock, it's short term. I wonder whether long COVID sort of challenges some of those ways of making sense of deservingness during COVID, as well as more broadly beyond long COVID, other people who find themselves claiming for longer.
Right, thank you. And move on to the next question. Anastasia Berry, do you think the government decision to increase universal credit by £20 compounded this view of exceptionalism among COVID claimants?
I could go first briefly, or Ben, please.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, one of the things that we discussed a lot was around furlough and the self-employment income support scheme, which I know somebody also asked about. In some countries, those people were supported through the benefit system effectively. The benefit system was set up that it could cope with these kind of changes. Whereas in the UK, a decision was made not to change the benefit system in order to provide it through that way, but to have a very sharp differentiation between the support that a lot of people got and the support that benefit claimants got, not that the number of benefit claimants wasn't large. So I think that separation probably contributed to kind of, there's the pre-pandemic versus COVID claimants, but there's also COVID claimants versus people that were furloughed or getting saved. And so there's a lot of differentiation in the British system, which possibly doesn't enable us to see it like all as a part and all as part of how we dealt with COVID.
So someone else did, and I accidentally moved it into the answered column due to Zoom cack-handedness, but someone else asked whether people considered furlough to be part of the benefit system. And we actually did directly ask that question in the survey. And I think it was about upwards of 80% of people said that they did not consider furlough to be part of the benefit system. So I think over and above the £20 uplift, which does make a distinction between pre and post COVID claimants, I think it is that distinction, as Ben is saying, that probably drove this exceptionalism to a greater extent.
Can I just, sorry, one thing I forgot to say is we also asked people directly if they think COVID claimants should be treated differently in the benefit system to pre-pandemic claimants, to which most people strongly said no. which then is a kind of an odd thing to put against the fact that the uplift was for universal credit and working tax credit and wasn't applied to legacy benefits. So it wasn't kind of explicitly pre-pandemic versus COVID claimants, but it very implicitly was, and that wasn't something I think the public would have supported, even though it seems to be hard to change.
And I think this links in with what we were saying a moment ago about knowledge of the system. So even among our interviews with COVID claimants themselves, it was uncommon that they were aware that the system as it existed during COVID was quite different to the pre-COVID system if there were people coming into contact with the system for the first time. So I think the idea that sort of details of the system during the pandemic would be something that people were aware enough of to kind of realise that there was this differential treatment isn't the case. Like I think people are obviously will miss the £20 uplift if it goes, but I think being aware of that as sort of a provision wasn't even something that was sort of very obvious to claimants themselves, basically.
Can I just say my 2 seconds of it's not an uplift, it's partial compensation for all the cuts we've had under Osborne, etc. But anyway, next question, Dumont. So I wonder what attitudes will be if and when universal basic income is implemented. Will there be a change as everyone gets the payment?
Can I answer this at the same time as the working labour question on how do you change deserving and undeserving excuse?
Yeah, so, I think it's woking labour actually.
Oh,
yeah,
sorry, working labour rather than working labour. Easy slip to make.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I think is really important is not to assume that people's perceptions of deservingness or how much attention they're paying to deservingness cues, how they're framing benefit claims in the system. It's not just due to the way that the media talks about it or the way that politicians talk about it, but there's also an extensive body of literature on the connection between the way people think and the way the system is set up. So really, we have a very means-tested system in the UK where the question the system is always saying is, are these people truly in need? Are they truly deserving? And it is very difficult to move the conversation, the framing away from that while our policies are still always bringing us back to this question. Whereas in other systems, the question would be, have you paid your contributions? That is the way the system works. It's a contribution-based system and people get much higher benefits, but with fewer questions about their deservingness, because that's just not the way the system is set up. So I think institutional design is really important, and that takes us into a whole different debate about, how do you break out of a very stable, hostile system? Which is another question. Around the basic income, I think it would be interesting to see what basic income would do in this context. The thing that I think is not always stated around basic income is, to my mind, the basis of legitimacy for basic income would be very strongly citizenship-based. And that means there is a lot of questions around if a basic income introduced is, who would be excluded from that? Already in the UK, we see that our contribution-based benefits to the state that they exist are much easier for migrants to claim than something like universal credit. And I think basic income might make that worse. But it would have other more positive consequences to some of these conversations as well. Sorry, a long rambling answer bringing together a couple of different things there.
Yeah, right. And does anyone want to add anything else on David Howden's question? Just pointing out universal credit, of course, is an in-work as well as an out-of-work benefit. And were attitudes to the different claimants for different reasons different?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question because we had the same thought when we were designing the survey. And we didn't explicitly ask about different types of claimant. However, we did at one point randomize whether we were cueing people to think about UC as an in-work benefit as well as an out-of-work benefit. So if you notice that, so if you remember the wording of the YouGov question about what proportion of claimants are deserving, is quite cumbersome in the sense that it says, remember that benefit claimants includes people who are in work, people who are disabled, people who are out of work. And that's to try and get away from this idea that if you just ask people about benefit claimants, their minds automatically go to this idea of an unemployed working age person. So what we tried to do was we asked the deservingness question where we explicitly did what YouGov did, which was saying, hey, remember that universal credit is an in-work as well as an out-of-work benefit. And then we also asked the question without doing that, to see whether that would actually make any difference to people's responses. And it actually didn't, which we were slightly surprised by, but I just think when people are answering surveys, it's actually very difficult to push them out of their default interpretation of what a question means. People are reading questions very quickly, they responding quite rapidly, often without a huge amount of thought behind it. So it's actually hard to get people out of the mindset of what constitutes a benefit claimant. And I don't know whether the wording we used actually managed to do that. So it would be something that we might be worth exploring a little bit further in our next wave of the survey.
Yep. And that is something to emphasize. There are 2 more waves, I think, of the study that are going to be carried out and reported on. So there's a lot more going to come out of this project. Let's move on with questions. Ed Pybus again from CPAG. Was there a specific policy reason for using furlough rather than using the benefit systems to create support, that it fits into dividing people up between deserving and undeserving claimants? Yeah, this is more a comment. I don't know if you got anything.
Yeah. I guess hard. You can speculate it partly was, but then our benefit system is not set up in a way that does earnings related benefits very well. And just because I see that Tina Hearn has put something in the chat rather than the Q&A around how you might change things at an attitudinal level. I think trying to create a basis for a more positive way of talking about the benefit system is really important. And I think trying to revitalize contributory benefits in a kind of 21st century way, taking account of all of Peter's work on the way in which new social risks differ from old social risks, but nevertheless trying to get away from it being just the last resort for people who are the poorest and most struggling, and to move to something broader. You could argue that UC might be a start on doing that, just because it covers so much of the population when it's rolled out. But I guess we will see on that.
Yeah, that's something I wanted to ask. When does exceptionalism come to an end? And is that something you'll be able to cover in future waves? Because I think that's a fascinating issue. Whether there are any strands in what's been seen as exceptional now that can be pulled out and made something of in a future politics of welfare.
Yeah, so when's the next wave of the survey, Ben?
Sometime before next March, when the project formally ends.
Yeah, so I guess it's possible that we will start to see, and if we could start to see some waning of this idea that COVID claimants are exceptional, if you're still claiming now when COVID is basically over, or to whatever extent people consider it to be over, then I can expect that you would see that this level of exceptionalism would be waning somewhat. I think a lot of it seems to be very heavily focused on lockdown, on that people can't go to work. There just really aren't the jobs out there. Whereas in fact, if you look at the news, if you look at the media now, a lot of the talk is about job shortages. It's about we don't have enough workers for these particular industries. And I think if that narrative continues, then this idea that these people are exceptional because they just can't go to work, it's obvious that they can't get a job, will have waned quite considerably by now.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. Can I ask, I think we've dealt with all the questions. Please raise your hand if you don't. But one thing I wanted to ask about is how all this relates to people's ideas about tax paying for the crisis and deficit and so on, are going to become much higher on the agenda as we move into the budget spending review and the constellation of cuts that we're going to find all around us. Is that an issue that affects people's attitudes? The idea that the respectable working people, are somehow paying for this lot of people who are dependent on them.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the austerity rhetoric. If we see a return to very strong austerity rhetoric, then we will probably see this. Yeah, this. I mean, we've seen it in other recessions, right? So Ben, you write about it in the report, about this idea that when people feel that the public funds and their personal funds are being pinched, then suddenly they become a lot more focused on their own, a lot less solidaristic with claimants, and the claimants are often a scapegoat, despite the fact that they don't take up anywhere near as much of government funding as people think they do.
Yeah.
One thing to say related to that from the perspective of claimants is then in our interviews with people in receipt of means tested benefits, there's still often, they articulate a very sort of direct transaction. And so you saw it in the end of Tim's account, like this idea that we're paying in or I've paid in. So it's not, it doesn't have to be, and it isn't necessarily sort of a strict contributory system that links people's kind of idea that I've paid in, then I get back. I think people, even when in receipt of means tested benefits, think, well, I've paid in various ways through my life in a sort of broader sense. And that is a very kind of direct transaction that I'm taking part in, entitles me to what I'm receiving. I'm not sure then if that, like we're saying, if that feeds through into kind of wider public attitudes, but at least that's how claimants sort of frame what they're doing.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we will see, you know, probably as it looks at the moment, the £20 uplift will be scrapped and we'll go back to the very low levels of benefits that we had before and that we have on legacy benefits. And then there will be a period of time where everything is to play for, where there will presumably be an attempt to do a very strong austerity framing around the need to keep benefits very low. And they will continue getting lower because of the George Osborne decisions on uprating. But at the same time, there is also a much wider body of support for making benefits more generous, which I would argue, given the fact that you see it across all political parties and people that read all newspapers and so on, all ages, that is probably reflecting just the realities of how difficult it is on benefits at the moment. So how all of these narratives come together, I think, is very unclear. I think, Peter, that you're right. There will be a lot of attention on the tax side of it and on the deficit, but this will be met also by a lot of potential support for benefit claimants, even after the COVID exceptionalism has ended. And we will have to pay careful attention to see quite how this plays out.
Yeah, one thing that will really need to be countered, I think, is an enduring perception that benefits became more generous during the pandemic and stayed that way. I think what you see in that kind of decade-long increase in generosity in people's attitudes to the benefit system is their awareness of how much damage austerity did. Like, people just had an intrinsic sense that benefits, you couldn't live on benefits. Like they kind of got the message that living on benefits was a terrible situation. Whereas now, furlough, the story around the uplift, story around the benefit system being a positive safety net during COVID, there is a risk that people will have got the sense that the benefit system is much more generous than it actually is, and won't notice that the uplift went away, and will be conflating furlough to some extent with the benefit system. So I think that narrative needs to be countered or nipped in the bud as quickly as possible if we're not to see a return to the kind of anti-welfare sentiment we saw around the last austerity drive.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, but I'm very concerned about how the discourse about old age pension increases plays out, about the discourse about increases for working age pensions. That's going to be something. Anyway, I'm sorry to say this, but it's now 12 o'clock, so we'll have to draw things to an end. Any final points from any of you?
I don't think so. I think that was, yeah. I think we've covered it, hopefully. Yeah,
just to say a huge thanks, Peter, for chairing the event. It's been great to have your questions and to have you involved, and thank you to everybody for coming along. The report is released today on our website. You can see the link in the chat, and you know, the project runs for a few months yet. So if you have further thoughts on it or things that you think we didn't look at that we should do, then do drop us an email and do sign up to our email list, because Kate is leading a package of work in the team on COVID exceptionalism and the quality of material and things around stigma. So there'll be more in this area to come.
Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right.
Cheers.
Cheerio.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for all the questions.